Picture a warship holding position in open water when the radios go hot at once. Dozens of small hulls breaking off the coastline from 3 or 4 directions simultaneously, closing fast, low in the water, barely a blip on radar until they're already inside the range where numbers matter more than firepower. That single tactical picture is the reason American commanders have spent months treating a handful of speedboats as more dangerous than anything sitting in a shipyard. It is not a hypothetical. It is training footage that predates this war, and it is, right now, the scenario shaping one of the largest coastal military operations the United States has run in the Middle East in a generation. To understand why that image matters, you have to go back to how this war actually started, because a lot of people jumped into this story late and missed months of context that make everything happening along the Iranian coast right now make sense. Late in February of this year, the United States and Israel launched a joint offensive against Iran that reshaped the Middle East almost overnight. The opening wave of strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, along with several senior figures in the country's military command. Iran called it an act of war without hesitation. Washington and Tel Aviv called it a preemptive strike, meant to stop something far more dangerous from fully taking shape. Within hours, missile fire was going both directions. Within days, the region was looking at the largest open conflict in the Middle East in a generation. One that pulled in allies, rattled energy markets, and put the whole world on edge. In the weeks right after that opening strike, American and Israeli air power shifted its attention almost entirely toward Iran's navy. Ports were hit hard and repeatedly. Naval facilities were bombed again and again. Ships were destroyed before they ever had the chance to leave harbor. If you'd pulled up satellite images from March, you could have reasonably concluded that Iran's naval capability had been wiped out completely. That conclusion would have been wrong, and understanding why it was wrong is really the key to everything that's happened since. Iran figured out decades before this war that it would never be able to field a navy capable of standing toe-to-toe with the United States. No amount of money, ambition, or engineering talent was going to hand Iran aircraft carriers, Aegis-equipped destroyers, or a fleet that could meet American sea power head-on, and Iranian military planners knew it. So instead of running a naval arms race they were guaranteed to lose, they built something else entirely. That strategy actually goes back further than most people realize, all the way to the so-called tanker war of the 1980s. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War, Iran watched its larger warships struggle against modern Western-style naval forces and learned a painful lesson early. Big, expensive ships are easy to spot, easy to hit, and brutally hard to replace quickly. Small, fast, cheap boats are the opposite in every respect. That lesson got baked permanently into Iranian military doctrine, and it only hardened with every decade that followed. So Iran built thousands of small, fast attack boats, each one costing a small fraction of a single frigate or destroyer. Boats built to carry anti-ship missiles or torpedoes, low-riding hulls that are genuinely hard to pick up on radar, and cheap enough to build that losing several in a single engagement barely dents Iran's overall capability. In the time and cost it takes to replace one larger warship, you can replace roughly 10 fast attack boats. That cold arithmetic shaped Iranian naval planning for about 20 years straight. And here's the part that should genuinely impress you, regardless of how you feel about the strategy itself. Iran didn't stop at building the boats. They carved entire secret bases directly into the rocky southern coastline and into select strategic islands inside the Strait of Hormuz. Real tunnels, genuine underground passages cut into solid rock over roughly 2 decades. These structures were built so fast, boats could sit sheltered from air raids, refuel, rearm, and get back out to sea within minutes of receiving an order. From above, on satellite photos, on a warship's radar picture, on drone footage, it all reads as bare rock, steep cliffs, empty coastline with nothing obvious to target. Then, almost without warning, a hidden entrance slides open, and the boats are already streaming toward global shipping lanes before anyone watching can react in time. That single reality explains why, months after the United States destroyed most of Iran's visible fleet, American officials were still describing Iranian fast attack boats as a real, serious, ongoing danger. The ships sitting exposed on satellite photos back in March were never the core of the problem. The ones hidden inside the mountains, invisible until the moment of launch, are why this threat has lasted as long as it has. Now walk through what's actually happened over the past several weeks, because this is where the confusion online tends to outrun what's actually been confirmed. In early July, Iranian forces attacked several merchant vessels operating near Oman. Central Command answered with one of the largest coordinated operations of the entire war. By its own public account, American forces struck more than 80 separate targets across southern Iran in a single wave. Air defense systems, command and control centers, coastal radar, anti-ship missile positions, and, by Central Command's own count, more than 60 fast attack boats belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, many of them caught near or around the islands that have quietly become the center of this entire story. Keshem Island, Bandar Abbas, and the small coastal town of Sirik. Those aren't random coordinates. Analysts have pointed to those exact locations for years as the real foundation of Iran's underground coastal boat network. That operation wasn't a one-off either. Right up through the middle of July, Central Command kept running new strike operations, and each one was publicly described as bigger than the last. One American official told reporters the mid-July operation was roughly 4 to 5 times larger than the strike that preceded it. Around the same window, Iranian state media reported explosions in Keshem and separately on Kish Island, another location long associated with Iran's coastal military infrastructure. Iran's semi-official news agency reported several explosions overnight in Sirik. On the American side, Central Command confirmed those missions targeted coastal surveillance systems, missile depots, and maritime strike assets, with the explicit goal of cutting into Iran's ability to threaten commercial and military shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Then, most recently, after Iran attempted a direct strike on American forces stationed in the region, Washington answered again, and this time with even greater intensity. Central Command described that round as a powerful retaliatory strike, one that hit military command centers, missile and drone production facilities, coastal monitoring positions, and what officials specifically referred to as maritime facilities. Explosions that night were reported across an unusually wide stretch of Iranian coastline: Bushehr, Kish Island, Abadan, and Keshem. One American official described the scope of that single night's air campaign as nearly double the previous strike. So if you're sitting there thinking, wait, didn't they already wipe out most of Iran's fleet back in March? That confusion makes complete sense. And honestly, that confusion is exactly why this story deserves more than a quick headline. The large, obvious naval vessels were mostly dealt with early in the war, in those first weeks of open conflict. Since then, it's been strike after strike, wave after wave, going after boats that were never sitting out in the open to begin with. Vessels stored inside hollowed-out rock, some behind reinforced armored doors, some with multiple hidden exits, all of it specifically engineered to survive exactly the kind of prolonged bombardment we've been watching for months. This is genuinely a choke point for the global economy, and that's exactly why both sides understand there's far more at stake here than a stretch of coastline. Insurance premiums for tankers have spiked sharply since the conflict began, even for operators still willing to risk the strait. Several major shipping companies have quietly rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to their voyages and millions of dollars in extra fuel costs just to avoid the risk. Some of the world's largest energy buyers have started diversifying away from oil supplies that depend on this specific route, purely because of the uncertainty. That shift alone could reshape global energy trade patterns for years, long after this war eventually ends. To really grasp the scale of what Iran built along its coast, compare it to something you may already be familiar with. Look at how Houthi forces in Yemen managed to disrupt Red Sea shipping while working with a fraction of the resources and firepower of an actual nation-state. If a smaller, less equipped group could cause that much global disruption with limited weapons and no real navy to speak of, imagine what a country that spent 20 years deliberately building hidden coastal infrastructure for exactly this purpose can absorb while under pressure. That comparison alone explains why this front of the war has been so difficult to shut down completely, no matter how many strikes get thrown at it. So strip away the dramatic headlines and stick strictly to what credible sources have actually confirmed, and here's the honest version. For roughly 2 decades, Iran built a defense system specifically designed to withstand exactly the kind of overwhelming air campaign it's facing right now. Fast boats hidden deep inside armored coastal caves. A layered doctrine built around one central idea. You don't have to win a fair fight against a much larger, better-funded military. You just have to make sure that military can never fully finish the job. And here we are, months into one of the most intense air campaigns this region has seen in decades. Despite dozens of documented strikes against the coastline surrounding these bases, that defense system is still functioning right now, even though it hasn't come through unscathed. The situation has clearly and significantly deteriorated for Iran, with confirmed losses of dozens of boats and major support facilities across several rounds of strikes. But it hasn't disappeared, despite plenty of headlines claiming otherwise. That's not a tidy, satisfying conclusion, and honestly, I'd rather be straight with you about that than manufacture some dramatic story about a final knockout strike that hasn't actually happened. There's no single decisive piece of footage where one side has clearly and completely won. What we're watching instead is something slower and, frankly, more historically typical than most war coverage tends to admit. Sustained pressure against infrastructure that was specifically built to be almost impossible to destroy in one strike. And if history teaches us anything about wars like this, it's that they rarely end with one knockout blow. They usually wind down through some messy combination of exhaustion on both sides, steady economic strain, and quiet diplomacy happening out of public view while the visible strikes keep making headlines. That might be the real lesson buried in this entire story. It was never just about boats, caves, or bombs. At its core, it's about what happens when a smaller power refuses to fight on the terms everyone expects and instead spends 2 decades building something patient, hidden, and designed to outlast the news cycle rather than win it in a single flashy battle in front of the cameras. Whether you see that as impressive ingenuity under pressure or as something far more unsettling probably depends on where you already stand on this conflict. And it's worth sitting with that question for a second, because there isn't a clean answer either way. There's a bigger piece of this conflict that barely gets mentioned in most of what's circulating online. The air campaign is only half of the pressure being applied to Iran. The other half is a naval blockade, and over time, that may matter even more than any single strike, no matter how dramatic the footage looks. After the United States reimposed a full blockade on Iranian ports, the financial toll has been enormous. Lost oil revenue running into the billions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of people affected by the ripple effects every single day. The blockade keeps grinding away at an economy that was already under serious strain from years of sanctions, long before this war ever started. Vessels headed toward Iranian ports have been intercepted. Some have been seized outright by the naval forces enforcing the blockade. Yes, a handful of ships have still managed to slip through, because no blockade in naval history has ever been completely airtight from day one. But the ongoing economic crisis Iran is facing right now is real. It's continuous week after week, and there's no real sign of it easing up. Picture the full weight of what Iran is dealing with at this exact moment. On one side, direct military strikes hammering the coastline and the hidden boat network with almost no let-up. On the other side, a major economic chokehold steadily draining its financial resources. Both efforts are running at the same time, deliberately structured to reinforce each other toward one shared goal: ending Iran's ability to threaten one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet. Clearing naval mines safely is slow, careful, and genuinely dangerous work even under ideal conditions. And it gets a lot more dangerous when the exact waters you're trying to clear are being watched by hidden fast boats that can appear from multiple directions without warning. Even if the shooting stopped completely tomorrow morning, the underwater threats wouldn't just vanish on their own. Making these waters safe again is going to take time, real risk to the crews involved, and serious resources, possibly for years after the last shot of this war is fired. Here's a question most mainstream coverage barely bothers to ask clearly. Why should any of this matter to you, sitting somewhere that might be thousands of miles from the Strait of Hormuz? Because roughly 1/5 of the entire world's daily oil supply moves through that single narrow channel. Every time a tanker gets delayed, seized, or forced to reroute because of this conflict, that impact ripples far beyond the region, showing up in fuel prices, shipping and insurance costs, and eventually in the price of everyday goods on shelves in countries that have nothing directly to do with this war. It's easy to forget that when you're only seeing strike footage and casualty counts, but real towns sit along that coastline with workers and families who've lived on that shore for generations, most of them with no connection whatsoever to any military target. Reports out of Iran describe civilian deaths and injuries from these repeated waves of strikes, including people who had nothing to do with whatever was actually being hit. That doesn't erase the genuine strategic importance of those targets. It just means this was never purely a story about hardware, boats, tunnels, and bombs. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with the next time this conflict shows up in your feed as just another headline about ships and strikes. Because somewhere behind every one of those numbers is a family wondering when normal life on that coastline comes back, if it ever does.